Think forward. Think Research Channel.
Coming up on Researching Maryland, how scientists track a killer. We'll take a look into the lives, research, and education of criminal investigators and forensic anthropologists. Today's Researching Maryland is all about using science to solve crimes, and it's next on UMTV. Welcome to Researching Maryland, a behind-the-scenes look at cutting-edge research at the University of Maryland. We'll visit labs all over the campus where professors and researchers are busy working on exciting projects that will change the world and change our daily lives. I'm your host, Andrew Wolvin. Thank you for being with us today. On TV shows such as CSI, we watch teams of investigators comb crime scenes. And in what seems like a matter of minutes, they find just the right clue to solve the crime and wrap up the show in their 60-minute slot. Our guest today quickly shares that these shows are nothing more than Hollywood glamour. Real investigation is much more complex and involves many more people. If anyone would know, Tom Mauriello would. He's been teaching criminalistics to University of Maryland students for 25 years. He's researched both the Goldman-Simpson murder investigation and the sniper attacks in Washington, D.C. He invited us to visit one of his classes. Here's more.
Tracking a killer, murder investigations. We see them nightly on our evening news and watch glamorizations on TV. But for one professor at the University of Maryland, teaching it is all in a day's work. He is Tom Mauriello, an adjunct professor of criminalistics, and his class, Introduction to Criminalistics, teaches students how to conduct basic crime scene investigation. He is an expert in the field and has written a book, Criminal Investigation Handbook, Strategy, Law, and Science, which includes a special supplement about the investigative issues during the Simpson-Goldman murder trial.
Crime scene investigation is when the police respond to a location where a crime has been reported. What they attempt to do at that point is to collect evidence and interview witnesses to determine two things. One, that a crime actually has been committed, and two, that a certain person or persons have committed that crime. Now, there's a number of players involved in doing that, unlike on television where crime scene investigation TV shows, one group of people do all those things. But it's a teamwork of uniform officers, investigators, evidence technicians. In the case of a dead body, the medical examiner has responsibility of the collection of evidence in reference to the body. Not the police. So there are a number of people involved in collecting evidence at the crime scene that we don't see on TV shows.
In the course, students learn how to gather samples and preserve crime scene evidence. They study the taking of fingerprints, identifying firearms and ballistics, and analysis of shoe and tire prints. They learn about trace evidence, forensic hypnosis, polygraph, and death investigation. If nothing else, they leave the class knowing the #1 rule of investigation: don't touch anything to alter the crime scene.
The biggest mistake that police officers in general make at crime scenes is they don't anticipate the needs and expectations of all the players involved in the investigation. They tend to focus on one thing, either looking for the suspect or helping the victim. They tend to overlook significant pieces of evidence or overlook the proper way to protect that evidence because they don't really recognize what's going to happen down the line.
The final exercise in the course asks students to use all of their newly acquired investigative skills to analyze a fake crime scene. These scenes are created by Mauriello using a dollhouse and dolls put in various scenarios. Students must comb the scene to figure out what happened and why. Mauriello's scenarios include date rape, robbery, suicide, and accidental death. Mauriello has taught the class at the University of Maryland for the last 25 years, and although technology has changed, his goals for his students have not.
Main goal that I have for my students is for them to think strategically when entering a crime scene, for them to be able to know the needs and expectations of all the players, and for them to recognize the capabilities of science when they're trying to find evidence, to know what kind of information will be derived from those pieces of physical evidence.
Mauriello is currently working on a supplement for his book about the Washington area sniper case.
Tom Mauriello joins us now on the set of Researching Maryland to tell us more about his class and his research. Tom, it's nice to see you.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Why is it so important to be so careful in a crime scene investigation?
Well, because the legal process later on during the trial will look at the minute details of every aspect, because the job of the defense attorney obviously is to try to find what went wrong to help their client to be found not guilty. So it's very important that every aspect of the investigation, according to the book, is done properly, because it's procedure that causes cases to be lost. Not so much the evidence, but the procedure is done, because defense attorneys look at books like mine and say, okay, what is the procedures that they should have done? And which steps did they not do? And that's how that's what we'll focus on, to try to discredit the evidence or discredit some aspect of the investigation.
You've looked at the Goldman-Simpson case and also the Washington sniper case. What observations do you make about those?
Well, in the O.J. Simpson case, as I call it, 33 investigative faux pas occurred. Now, all
33.
33. The forensic evidence was sound in the O.J. Simpson case. It was the procedures to identify it, to analyze it, and to present it to a court of law that went bad. For example, they found significant hairs on the body that were similar to that of O.J. Simpson. The problem was that the uniform officer at the beginning, because he saw the gruesome bodies, he tried to protect those gruesome bodies from the public that was starting to collect. So he took a blanket from the couch inside the house and then took it and covered the bodies. Well, first violation, you never add or take away from a crime scene. When the prosecution tried to present that evidence as this is why we believe O.J. Simpson's involved, his hairs were found on the body, they said, well, isn't it possible, and that word hurts us in courts, isn't it possible that those hairs came from O.J. Simpson weeks and months before when he was visiting to pick up his children, that they fell off his head, landed on that blanket, and then when the officer took that blanket and put it on the bodies, those hairs fell on the body. Isn't that possible? Well, yes, it's possible. Is it probable? No. But the jury hears that possibility, and then all of a sudden that evidence is not important to them in their mind's eye.
The power of a word, possible.
Absolutely.
When you say that the public started to collect, what do you mean?
Well, when although it was early in the morning, when the public started standing around looking outside the perimeter of the crime scene, they could actually see the bodies. And so in an attempt to cover it so people wouldn't see the gruesome bodies, the police tried to cover it. They tried to save the people from having to see that. First of all, if you don't want to see it, then don't stand there. Type of thing.
Sure.
But there are a number of observations. For example, the time of death was very important to try to prove O.J. Simpson was involved. Could he have committed those crimes and got back in time to be seen by the limousine driver when he was going to be picked up for the airport? So exact time of death is very difficult. There is no physical evidence that you can find or collect that will talk about the exact time of death. Only on TV do we get that.
Sure.
I love on TV where somebody bends over, touches the body, and turns to the officer and says, died at 8:15 last night, Joe. I'd like to know what he touched down there to get that information, because there's no evidence. So various things, like when they got to the scene, they found candles lit up in the bedroom where Nicole's bedroom was. She had drawn a bathtub. Nobody could tell us whether the water was hot or warm or cool. They blew out the candles and never took observation of at what point, how long do you think they were lit. There was ice cream, a cup of ice cream on the stairwell that we believe Nicole left when she answered the door or went outside or whatever the case may be. No one could tell us how long that ice cream may have been there, how long had it been melted. Those could have been indicators of time that could have helped significantly.
Closer to home, do you have observations about the Washington sniper case?
Well, right now, because the case hasn't been introduced, the only information I have is from public documents and from the media. The most significant problem or concern, in my opinion, right now on the Washington sniper case was the conflict between the media and the police in reference to presenting information. In my opinion, the media's presentation of significant pieces of information during the sniper case caused for people to be injured. Every time there was a shooting, the first thing the media did was share with the people exactly where the roadblocks were. Well, that was providing intelligence information to the snipers. The other thing is, police need to have a better understanding of what critical information needs to be protected. A lot of information from police officers, investigators, was shared with the media that should have been protected, which ultimately may cause problems later on down at trial, and we don't know what they will be until we go to trial.
What you say makes so much sense, and yet why is there such a gap between the research in this area and the actual practice? Why is there not more care in investigation?
Well, the very first person that testified in the O.J. Simpson case was the first uniform officer at the scene. And when the defense was criticizing him for his lack of protection of physical evidence, he made a powerful statement. He said, when I went to the police academy and when I received my training, they spent a small amount of time on the preservation and protection of crime scenes. Because the focus for uniform officers is how to write a ticket, how to put handcuffs on somebody, how to make a good arrest, how to fill out the forms, etc. And there isn't a lot of time. In fact, the only time a police officer gets enough training on the forensics and the capabilities is later on when he becomes a detective. And many times that training doesn't come till after he's been on the job. It's on the job training. So there's not a lot of time and effort spent on understanding science and what science can do for them.
So we need to come back to your dollhouse. Now, as we were looking at that, that's dollhouse size. That's not full stage set.
It's a 1-inch scale.
Fascinating. Why have you considered that someone like you ought to be brought in as the consultant to be there on scene as there is a crime investigation?
Well, someone like myself is brought in as a consultant for the defense team all the time. Police, the criminal justice system has experts. The problem is that an investigation is a process of activities, from somebody reporting a crime to somebody being presented in a court of law to answer for that crime. And all these different process activities are going on, but by the time the process owner, the person who's responsible for presenting the case to court, and that's the prosecutor, by the time he or she gets it, all the mistakes have happened already. And so we need to get the prosecutor process closer to the beginning so they can oversee that and make sure that all the players that are going to be involved better understand. I teach what I call strategic investigations. I teach my students to think not only for themselves, depending on what role they're playing, but also for the other players. They need to think about the medical examiner, the anthropologist, the detectives who are going to interview people, the scientists. What are the scientists going to need to analyze evidence that they might have to protect right away?
And we should be encouraged that those students are the answer for the future, correct?
Absolutely.
Indeed.
Absolutely.
Tom, thanks so much for joining us today.
No, I appreciate it.
We need to take a short break right now, but when we return, how forensic anthropologists play an important part in death investigation. Stay with us.
With over 100 patents to his credit, Dr. Robert Fischel has enjoyed a prolific career of invention. While working at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, Fischel made substantial contributions to the space industry. But he's also brought space technology down to Earth by applying his innovations to biomedicine. By using his technological expertise to create medical devices, Dr. Fischel has saved and improved thousands of lives around the world. His rechargeable cardiac pacemaker can operate in a person's body for up to 25 years without removal or repair, while his stents bring hope to people with heart disease by keeping their arteries open without bypass surgery. But it's his invention of the implantable artificial pancreas that has garnered the most recognition. By automatically dispensing insulin accurately and safely, Fischel's infusion pump has made great strides in the treatment of diabetes. This medical milestone earned Dr. Fischel the prestigious Inventor of the Year Award in 1984. With endless ingenuity and vision, Dr. Fischel does more than keep in step with technology. He sets its pace.
Welcome back. We've already learned that it takes a team of experts, many of them scientists, to solve crimes. It's a particular type of scientist that's called in during a death investigation. Forensic anthropologists have the task of identifying human remains when other methods fail. A grisly job, but one that requires much skill, education, and experience. These scientists must know anatomy, genetic and cultural variations, as well as having experience with many cases to use for comparison. Marilyn London is one of only 150 forensic anthropologists in the country. She teaches an introductory laboratory course at the University of Maryland. During a recent visit to her lab, she introduced us to the unique field of forensic anthropology.
Identification of human remains is one way scientists can help police with investigations. Known as forensic anthropologists, these scientists can identify bone variations that often lead to many conclusions about the deceased. Marilyn London is one of only 150 forensic anthropologists in the U.S. She is a lecturer in the Department of Anthropology, who teaches an introductory laboratory course at the University of Maryland. Through the careful collection and inspection of bones, London can measure, test, and analyze bones to determine many things, whether the bones are from a human, the age and height of the person, if the person had diseases or ailments, and the causes of death. She can also determine things about a person's way of life.
The first thing that we need to do is figure out whether the bone is human or not. And then once you've gone beyond that, you can figure out how many humans you have represented with the bones you have. And then you start asking questions about the age of the individual, which it's easier with younger individuals because they're still growing and their teeth are still erupting, and you can do some measurements to determine the age. With older individuals, it's a little more difficult. You have to look for signs of deterioration, which start about age 25. We can determine the sex of an individual by looking at different parts of the skeleton, mostly in the pelvic area, because female hips are designed for childbirth and males are not. But there are differences in the skulls, too, that we would look at, and measurements throughout the skeleton that we can take.
Many of these conclusions are discovered through the analysis of human variation. Variations are differences in bones that result from genetic inheritance, environmental factors, and from cultural variation.
Just as you walk around campus and you see that everyone, except the identical twins, looks different from everyone else, the human skeleton for each person looks different from every other skeleton, a little bit. In general, we have the same bones, the same number of bones, and that sort of thing. But as you go through life, you accumulate fractures, you get different kinds of dental work, you have different kinds of surgery. If your nutrition is bad, you don't grow as tall as you might have. And so you have to look at a lot of skeletons to realize how much variation there can be within the norm in order to tell what's abnormal when you look at the skeleton.
In her biological anthropology lab, students learn the basic skills of recognizing and measuring bone, comparison of modern humans to fossils and non-human primates, documenting human variation, and the basics of analyzing archaeological sites that contain human bones.
In forensic anthropology, this is an application of all of the subfields of biological anthropology to the medical legal investigation of death. So you need to know human anatomy, you need to know how traits are inherited, so that's the genetics part. You need to know how much variation is normal, you need to recognize pathological conditions in bones, and you need to know all the statistics to be able to analyze all of those things. So there's a lot of basic skills that you need to learn in anthropology, and then you have to accumulate a lot of experience, because every forensic case that I work on is new, and I learn something from every single case I work on.
An expert in the field of forensic anthropology, London is a member of DMORT, the government's Disaster Mortuary Operational Response Team. London also does contract work for medical examiners' offices and museums.
Marilyn London is here to talk with us more about her work. Marilyn, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Interesting work. How did you happen to become a forensic anthropologist?
Well, I was always interested in anthropology. Even in 6th grade, I was interested in the mummies of Egypt. And when I got to college, I realized that everything I studied was about different cultures and different human variation. And then I ended up taking a skeletal anatomy course at the Smithsonian, and I knew right away that was what I wanted to do.
It's such a fascinating application for someone who has studied in anthropology. What's necessary in terms of background qualifications for this kind of job?
Well, you have to have a great appreciation for how much variation there is in the human skeleton, just like you see on campus, as we mentioned before, that everyone looks a little bit different. And every skeleton looks a little bit different. So you have to know what's normal and what's abnormal. You have to know about growth and development of the skeleton. You have to understand that bone is living tissue, and that it will respond to different kinds of stress, like nutritional stress or disease or some kind of trauma. The bone will respond actively to those different stresses, and you can read something about the life of the person in the skeleton.
You've brought with you some examples, some models. Would you like to share?
Oh, sure. This is a cast of a human skull. It's fairly recognizable as human when you look at it. Some of the features that we look at to, for instance, determine the sex of an individual are in the skull. The back of the skull in males has kind of a ridge of bone for the neck muscles to attach to. And you also often see a kind of a heavy brow ridge in males, whereas in females that's going to be smooth in the back and smooth in the front. Also in the chin, if you look at males, they tend to have a squared off projecting chin, and females tend to have a more pointy chin. So we look at these tiny features one by one and kind of get the whole concept of what that represents in this individual. We can show the other specimen I brought as well. This is the pelvic girdle. This happens to be a male pelvic girdle. This structure is very important if you think about it. It's the base of the torso, and so it supports the whole upper body. It's the top of the locomotion system. The head of the femur fits in here. That's that ball and socket joint that you learn about. And it protects some of the organs in the abdomen. So it has many functions, and each little feature that you look at in this pelvic girdle represents one of the functions of the structure. So in males, we have a kind of a different pelvic girdle than in females, because in females the birth canal has to be large enough for a child to get through. In males, that's not necessary. And so the males tend to be narrower for their size, and this opening tends to be smaller. This, by the way, is a much more efficient structure than the female pelvis in terms of locomotion.
That's interesting to know. Another gender difference
That's
here.
Right.
Do you use this in terms of preparing your students who then will go into law enforcement and be part of crime scene investigation?
I hope that they use this information when they go. What I try to emphasize is the same things that you would do at any crime scene. When you have a skeleton, you have to think about what the context is and what other information is there, and you have to collect the whole skeleton, and that doesn't always happen at a crime scene, and make sure that you understand where you fit into the team. For instance, there are forensic dentists who will be looking at the teeth to try to get an identification, and there will be pathologists who will be looking at any trauma that you find on the skeleton. The anthropologist looks at the age and the sex and the stature, how tall someone is, and any diseases that might have affected the person during the life, to try to also contribute to the identification of the individual.
We're probably very, very conscious of this given the Chandra Levy case that received so much public attention here in the Washington area.
Right.
Are there other applications for forensic anthropology beyond crime scene?
Well, yes. It kind of goes two different directions. Most of my work is actually not forensic work. I work on archaeological sites and historic cemeteries. So, and the same skills that you use for forensic anthropology can be used to analyze skeletons from those settings. On the other extreme, we have mass disasters, where often there's what we call a high degree of fragmentation of the skeleton. And because the anthropologists have studied each bone so carefully and looked at the muscle attachments, and they know about how much variation there is, and you can recognize these little features, we can take small fragments of bone and identify what bone it is, which side it is. Sometimes you can tell something about whether it's male or female, if there's a disease process there.
And so this would have application, for example, in the disastrous Columbia NASA disaster.
Exactly, yes. There were anthropologists involved in recovering some of the astronauts' remains. And one of the reasons we get called in is that we recognize the skeletal material that's found.
Who are your students?
Well, here at the University of Maryland, we have a lot of anthropology majors take the course. It's actually a required course for anthropology majors, but we also, since it's a lab course, it fulfills a requirement for a lab science, and I get computer science students and political science students and artists, and it's kind of interesting to get their perspective on what I'm doing, because they're not thinking about anthropology all the time like I am.
You're such an interesting example also in terms of applying what you do to real-world applications. Could you talk a little bit about DMORT?
Oh, DMORT, that's the Disaster Mortuary Operational Response Team. And it used to be part of Health and Human Services. Now it's part of the Homeland Security Department. DMORT is a group of 10 teams around the country that respond to mass disasters when there are a lot of deaths, and when there are so many deaths that the local people can't handle that number of deaths. There are anthropologists, there are pathologists, dentists, morticians, x-ray technicians, security people. We have many positions on the team, and people get deployed. It's actually sort of military. We get deployed to a scene when those areas of expertise are needed.
What important, fascinating work. Marilyn, thanks so much for being with us. And that's all the time that we have for this episode of Researching Maryland. I want to thank my guests for joining us and letting us spend some time in their labs observing their work. I also want to thank you for watching, and until next time, I'm Andrew Wolvin for Researching Maryland.